On a crisp autumn morning, long after the last of the Gilded Age mansions had crumbled or become museums, a tourist might stand in the shadow of a marble staircase and wonder what life was like for the men and women who built these temples to their own glory. The marble is cold now. The halls are empty except for echoes. Portraits of stern-faced industrialists and their elegantly dressed wives stare down from gilded frames, their eyes following a path that leads back to a time when wealth seemed boundless. This story is not just about architecture. It is about people and their fall. It begins with ambition, with oceans and rails and the rising smoke of factories. It ends with ruin, with divorce, with children squandering fortunes, and names that once commanded respect becoming punchlines. To understand why the Gilded Age elites fell, we must walk through their drawing rooms, cross their decks, sit at their tables and follow them into courtrooms where their empires were dismantled. During the late 19th century, the United States experienced a transformation unlike anything the young nation had ever seen. Steam engines powered locomotives across the continent. Telegraph wires draped between poles carried news at lightning speed. Immigrant workers poured through ports, their hands and backs fueling a new industrial order. In this tumultuous environment, a small group of men amassed fortunes so vast that they rivaled the treasuries of European kingdoms. Newspapers called the era the Gilded Age, implying that beneath the glittering surface lay corruption and decay. The gilding was real, though. Gold leaf-covered ceilings, silver spoons lined table settings, diamonds glittered on corsages worn to winter balls. But gilding can hide rot. For every gala there were strikes, tenement fires, and diseases spread by overcrowded slums. In this world of extremes, the elites isolated themselves from the people whose labor paid for their luxuries. The distance between classes would become both a shield and a weakness. It kept the elites safe for a time, and then it left them vulnerable when the world changed and they could not adapt. To see how quickly fortunes rose and fell, consider the story of the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, started as a ferryman in New York Harbor and built a shipping empire before turning his attention to railroads. He consolidated lines, crushed competitors, and made headlines when he donated $1 million to found a university that still bears his name. His shrewdness and ferocity created a fortune that by the 1870s was unequaled. When he died in 1877, he left the bulk of his estate to his son, William Henry. William doubled the family's wealth in less than a decade. To celebrate his success, he built the largest private residence in New York, a mansion on Fifth Avenue with 137 rooms. His wife supervised every detail, from the imported Italian marble to the carvings of grapevines that curled around the dining room doors. Guests described the house as overwhelming. It was more than a home. It was a public declaration of supremacy. Other Vanderbilt cousins built their own palaces. Marble House in Newport, Breakers by the Sea, Biltmore on a North Carolina hilltop. The family seemed invincible. Biltmore deserves special attention. George Washington Vanderbilt, the youngest of William Henry's 8 children, did not share his brother's interest in railroads. He loved books and agriculture. He purchased 125,000 acres in the mountains near Asheville and hired architect Richard Morris Hunt and landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted to create a French Renaissance chateau and a working estate. The house contained over 250 rooms, a grand banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling, a library with 10,000 volumes, and a winter garden filled with exotic plants. Outside, Olmsted carved roads that wound through forests and fields, planted thousands of trees, and built a dairy and model farm. The estate was a marvel of craftsmanship and technology. It had electricity, elevators, central heating, and refrigeration. When Biltmore opened to guests on Christmas Eve 1895, it symbolized not only Vanderbilt wealth, but the idea that money could cultivate culture in the American wilderness. Yet it was also a monument to hubris. George spent far more than the estate ever earned. He married late, had one daughter, and died in his 50s. His widow struggled to maintain the property. By the 1930s, she opened the house to the public to pay the taxes. The once private enclave became a tourist attraction. The fall was graceful, but it was a fall nonetheless. The Vanderbilt story also illustrates the dangers of generational wealth. Cornelius built the fortune. William multiplied it. The third generation began to consume it. Consuelo Vanderbilt, William's granddaughter, was forced into a loveless marriage to the Duke of Marlborough to exchange American money for a European title. The marriage ended in divorce. Another grandson, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, perished on the Lusitania when a German torpedo struck the liner in 1915. Yet another branch of the family became known less for business acumen and more for scandals. Gloria Vanderbilt, a great-great-granddaughter, became a fashion designer and socialite, and saw her own fortune rise and fall with trends. The Vanderbilt mansions in New York were demolished by the 1920s and 1930s, replaced by skyscrapers. Their Newport cottages became museums or fell into disrepair. Within 50 years, the family's physical presence in the cities they once dominated had vanished. Wealth without purpose, it turns out, is difficult to preserve. If the Vanderbilts epitomized extravagance, the Astor family epitomized social power. John Jacob Astor arrived from Germany in the late 18th century, sold furs, bought Manhattan real estate, and became the richest man in America. His descendants inherited not just money, but a position at the top of New York society. Caroline Astor, known as Mrs. Astor, ruled the city's elite during the Gilded Age. She determined who was invited to her ballroom and who was excluded. To be recognized by Mrs. Astor meant acceptance into the 400, the supposed number of people who mattered. She built a brownstone mansion at 34th Street, then moved uptown to Fifth Avenue as the city expanded. Her son John Jacob Astor IV constructed two adjacent hotels, the Waldorf and the Astoria, after he quarreled with his cousin and built a hotel next door out of spite. The rivalry produced the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a symbol of luxury and extravagance that served as a public living room for the wealthy. The Astors seemed less flamboyant than the Vanderbilts. They were guardians of old money propriety, yet their story also ended in tragedy. When the Titanic struck an iceberg in April 1912, John Jacob Astor IV was among the passengers. He had recently divorced and married a much younger woman. They were returning from a European honeymoon. As the ship listed, he helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat. She survived. He did not. His body, recovered from the icy Atlantic, was found with thousands of dollars sewn into his pocket. The spectacle of his death on the most luxurious ocean liner ever built underscored the fragility of wealth. The Titanic disaster was one of several moments that shattered the illusion of invulnerability that surrounded Gilded Age elites. Another came from the courts. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into a near monopoly by ruthlessly undercutting competitors, securing secret railroad rebates, and absorbing smaller firms. By 1900, he controlled 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. His fortune made him the target of muckraking journalists and populist politicians. In 1904, Ida Tarbell, whose father had been ruined by Rockefeller, published a series of articles exposing Standard Oil's tactics. Her work galvanized public opinion. President Theodore Roosevelt, despite his own patrician background, declared himself a trust buster. The Department of Justice filed suit against Standard Oil in 1906 under the Sherman Antitrust Act. After years of litigation, the Supreme Court in 1911 ordered the breakup of Standard Oil into separate companies. The decision did not impoverish Rockefeller. The pieces of Standard Oil quickly increased in value. But the era of unchecked monopoly had ended. Government regulation and public scrutiny would become permanent features of American capitalism. The elites could no longer operate solely behind closed doors. Railroad tycoon Jay Gould provides another case study in how unscrupulous tactics could generate immense wealth and even more resentment. Gould manipulated stocks, bribed legislators, and conspired with financiers like James Fisk to corner markets, most famously in the attempt to corner the gold market that led to the 1869 Black Friday panic. He made millions while farmers, workers, and small investors suffered. Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner satirized men like Gould in their novel The Gilded Age, portraying speculators who cared more for personal gain than for the nation. Gould died rich, but his reputation never recovered. His son, George J. Gould, inherited railroads and estates, but lacked his father's cunning. Within a few decades, the family's wealth declined. Lavish homes had to be sold or boarded up. The public's disdain for the name persisted. In this way, moral judgments became economic liabilities. Families whose fortunes were built on exploitation found that when the public mood shifted, their enterprises suffered and their heirs faced hostility. No discussion of Gilded Age elites is complete without mentioning Andrew Carnegie and his steel empire. Carnegie immigrated from Scotland as a child, worked in textile mills and telegraph offices, and mastered the American railroad network under the mentorship of Tom Scott. He invested in steel production and built the largest steel plant in the world at Homestead, Pennsylvania. Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich had a duty to use their fortunes to improve society. He endowed libraries, universities, and concert halls. Yet his own company inflicted terrible violence on workers. In 1892, when employees at the Homestead plant struck for higher wages and union recognition, Carnegie's partner Henry Clay Frick locked them out and hired Pinkerton agents to break the strike. A battle ensued. Shots were fired. Workers and agents were killed. The Pennsylvania National Guard eventually restored order, and the Union was crushed. Carnegie was in Scotland during the conflict, but the public held him accountable. The Homestead strike became a symbol of the gulf between the rhetoric of philanthropy and the reality of labor exploitation. It tarnished Carnegie's legacy and contributed to broader demands for reform. J. Pierpont Morgan, a financier with a bulbous nose and piercing eyes, seemed to personify the confidence and arrogance of the era's banking elites. Morgan financed railroads, reorganized companies, and rescued the federal government during the Panic of 1895 by arranging a loan of gold to replenish the treasury. When the Panic of 1907 threatened to collapse the financial system, President Roosevelt turned to Morgan. He gathered bankers in his library on Madison Avenue and personally directed the rescue of failing trusts and the stock exchange. His authority seemed absolute. Yet by the time of his death in 1913, public trust in private bankers had eroded. The following year, Congress created the Federal Reserve System to provide a more systematic response to financial crises. Morgan's personal intervention had been necessary because the government lacked tools. His death spurred the creation of those tools. The era in which a single financier could dictate national policy had passed. While the elites built palaces and trusts, millions of immigrants lived in tenements, worked 10-hour days, and endured conditions that seemed medieval. Journalists like Jacob Riis photographed children sleeping on fire escapes and families crowded into windowless rooms. Reformers like Jane Addams founded settlement houses in Chicago to offer education and services to immigrants. Labor organizers like Samuel Gompers led strikes demanding shorter hours and safer workplaces. Populists in the Midwest decried railroad monopolies and demanded currency reform. Farmers struggling with debt formed alliances and parties to challenge Wall Street. The gulf between the mansions of Fifth Avenue and the sweatshops of the Lower East Side was not only economic, it was a gulf in experience and empathy. As long as the economy expanded, the elites could ignore the gulf. But recessions and panics made their isolation dangerous. The Panic of 1893 caused hundreds of banks to fail and sent unemployment skyrocketing. Protesters marched on Washington in Coxey's army. When the public's patience wore thin, politicians responded with reforms like the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and the 8-hour workday for certain industries. Each reform chipped away at the unfettered power of industrialists. Even within the mansions, there were signs of fragility. Marriages were often transactions rather than unions of affection. Alva Smith married William Kissam Vanderbilt and used his money to storm New York society, building Marble House and staging lavish balls designed to outshine Mrs. Astor. When she tired of her husband's infidelities, she divorced him, an act scandalous for the time, and married another rich man whose family owned railroads. Alva later became an active supporter of women's suffrage, illustrating how a woman who benefited from patriarchal wealth could also rebel against it. Her daughter Consuelo's forced marriage to the Duke of Marlborough eventually ended in her independence. Stories like these reveal that the lives inside the mansions were often as tumultuous as those outside. The wealth did not guarantee happiness or stability. In some cases, it magnified conflicts because reputations were at stake and stakes were high. Architecture itself became a stage on which these dramas played out. Architects like Stanford White, Richard Morris Hunt, and McKim, Mead, and White created palatial homes inspired by European castles and palaces. They imported marble from Italy, tapestries from France, and craftsmen from across the Atlantic. The dining rooms at Marble House had walls of gilded panels. The ballroom at the Breakers had a ceiling painted with allegorical figures. The staircase at the New York Vanderbilt House rose under a domed skylight. These spaces were intended to impress, to legitimize American wealth by placing it in conversation with European aristocracy. But the houses were often used only a few weeks a year. During the season, they were full of life. Then they were shuttered. Keeping them maintained required armies of servants. When the fortunes declined or the heirs lost interest, the houses deteriorated quickly. Many were demolished because property taxes and maintenance costs exceeded what the families could or would pay. The rubble filled landfills. The stones built new buildings. The destruction of the mansions symbolized the end of an era. Where they stood, apartment towers rose. Space once used by a single family now housed hundreds. Generational decline can be measured not only in dollars, but in engagement. The men who built fortunes were obsessed with their businesses. They knew every track on their railroads and every barrel in their refineries. Their sons and daughters often preferred art, travel, or leisure. There is nothing inherently wrong with that, but it meant they were less capable of defending their wealth when circumstances changed. Some gave their money to philanthropic causes, which eroded the principle. Others gambled on bad investments. Taxes introduced in the early 20th century, including the federal income tax in 1913 and estate taxes, further reduced fortunes. The Great War demanded patriotic donations. The stock market crash of 1929 obliterated paper wealth. The Great Depression wiped out businesses. Families that survived did so by diversifying, working, and sometimes hiding. Those that did not found themselves selling jewelry to pay grocery bills. Stories of auctioned heirlooms and sealed-off ballrooms became common by the 1930s. Servants were dismissed. Gardens grew wild. Photographs from the period show yawning porticos with peeling paint and ballroom floors covered in dust. It did not happen overnight. Each family faced a unique path to decline. But the pattern repeats: creation, consolidation, consumption, dispersal. Amid this decline, some members of the elites reimagined their roles. Henry Ford, though not a classic Gilded Age baron, built an automobile empire that undercut some railroads. He paid workers $5 a day, a radical wage at the time, believing that well-paid workers would buy his cars. He detested Wall Street and refused to take his company public. His anti-Semitic views and union-busting later tarnished his reputation. Yet he represented a new kind of industrialist, one who sought mass markets rather than exclusive luxury. His success signaled that the age of bespoke mansions might give way to the age of mass-produced suburbia. Other heirs turned to activism. Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of women's rights pioneer Elizabeth Cady Stanton, married a wealthy Englishman but spent her life fighting for suffrage and social reforms. Some heirs ran for political office. Others wrote memoirs or novels about their gilded childhoods, exposing hypocrisies and abuses. The Progressive Era and World War I accelerated the dismantling of old elites. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson championed regulatory legislation. The 17th Amendment mandated direct election of senators, reducing the ability of wealthy men to purchase seats through state legislatures. The Federal Reserve Act created a central bank. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened the government's ability to regulate monopolies. Child labor laws, workers' compensation, and safety standards improved lives. Prohibition, though largely a failure, disrupted the social scene of the elite by closing their clubs and eliminating one of the industries that had enriched some families. Women gained the right to vote in 1920, challenging patriarchal control. The world that produced the mansions was being dismantled piece by law. The Great Depression delivered the coup de grâce. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment reached 25%. Even the rich suffered. Those who had leveraged their holdings were wiped out. Those who had invested in speculative ventures saw them vanish. The values of estates plummeted. Families were forced to sell assets at rock-bottom prices. Some sold ancestral homes to colleges or nonprofits for a fraction of their cost. Others donated houses to the states to avoid taxes. The notion that fortunes would last forever proved false. As the Depression lingered, the government expanded welfare programs. Franklin Roosevelt, himself from an elite family, taxed high incomes and championed Social Security. His policies were popular with voters but reviled by some of his peers. Letters between wealthy families from the 1930s reveal bitterness and fear. They felt under siege. They looked to Europe, where revolution and war threatened property and life, and wondered whether America might go the same way. Their fear further undermined their confidence and their ability to act collectively. When World War II erupted, some mansions found new uses. The United States government requisitioned estates for training in convalescence. Biltmore housed art from the National Gallery in Washington for safekeeping. Estates in Long Island became Coast Guard stations or hospitals. After the war, some of these properties returned to families, but the expenses of repair were often prohibitive. Suburbanization further decreased the appeal of urban mansions. Families moved to the suburbs for privacy and modern amenities. Apartment living became fashionable. The last of the old guard retreated to fewer, smaller homes. Their heirs often had professional careers and did not desire to maintain gilded relics. By the late 20th century, many once private estates had become museums, hotels, or campuses. The Breakers in Newport is now a house museum visited by thousands each summer. Marble House stands open for tours. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel moved to Park Avenue and was recently closed for renovation to convert part of it into condominiums. The Biltmore Estate operates as a tourist attraction and winery. These transformations reflect both respect for the craftsmanship of the era and a practical recognition that such spaces must earn money to survive. In some ways, the public has become the new heir, able to wander through rooms once reserved for a select few. Standing on the marble floors, hearing docents recount tales of gowns and yachts, we see both the beauty and the waste. The transformation also points to the resilience of these buildings. Even as families fell, the structures endured, albeit with new purposes. So why did they all fall? It was not a single cause. Some lost their fortunes through mismanagement or extravagance. Others were undone by lawsuits and regulation. Still others faced disasters like the Titanic or the Lusitania or the stock market crash. Underlying all of these, however, was a failure to adapt. The world that had allowed a handful of men to accumulate astonishing wealth changed. Railroads gave way to automobiles and airplanes. Oil booms gave way to diversification. Public sentiment turned against monopolies. Political reforms curbed the power of money in government. Tax policies prevented the accumulation of dynastic wealth. Educational opportunities broadened, enabling people outside elite circles to compete. Social norms evolved. Divorce became more common. Women gained independence. Class deference declined. In this new world, a family name and a mansion were no longer enough. Those who adapted, like the Rockefellers, survived by focusing on philanthropy, professional management of trusts, and modern investments. Those who did not became footnotes in history books. There is also an emotional dimension to the fall of the elites. For many of them, money had been both a shield and a prison. It insulated them from want, but isolated them from the experiences of most Americans. When the shield cracked, they had little practice in resilience. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a haunting sadness. Women wrote of loveless marriages, of expectations they could never escape, of children sent away to be raised by nannies. Men wrote of pressures to maintain appearances even when finances were strained. Servants overheard arguments about unpaid bills. The glitter hid loneliness and fear. When the families fell, some felt relief. Freed from the need to perform wealth, they pursued interests and careers. Others struggled. There is no single emotional arc, but there is a common thread. The wealth that had promised security did not guarantee happiness. Reflecting on the dark story of America's Gilded Age elites, we see a tale of ambition and excess, of creativity and cruelty. We see men who built networks of rails and telegraphs that knit the nation together. We see women who turned social gatherings into instruments of power and later into platforms for reform. We see innovations in technology, finance, and architecture that still shape our world. And we see the costs: communities polluted, workers exploited, fortunes squandered, families torn apart. The gilding eventually wore off. What remains are lessons. Wealth can accomplish wonders, but it can also corrode character. Power can build libraries and hospitals, but it can also silence dissent. Names that once commanded fear and admiration can fade faster than paint on a ballroom ceiling. The marble and plaster may crumble, but the stories endure, cautionary and compelling. Walking through a deserted mansion on an autumn morning, listening to the echoes, we hear not just the voices of people who once laughed here, but the whisper of a warning. Everything that glitters is not gold, and every empire built without regard for its foundations will, in time, fall. Henry Clay Frick, an industrialist who partnered with Andrew Carnegie before they fell out, represents another strand of the dark tapestry. Frick amassed his fortune in coke, the processed coal essential for steel production. Born in rural Pennsylvania, he built a network of ovens, bought out competitors, and supplied Carnegie with fuel. The partnership was fruitful but fraught. Frick's management style was uncompromising. He opposed unions and once said he would rather see all his employees dead than let them have a say in his business. His ruthlessness culminated in the Homestead strike, when he ordered the Pinkertons to force their way through striking steelworkers, leading to bloodshed. Frick's disdain for the lives of ordinary people extended beyond his mills. As president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, He joined other Pittsburgh magnates in turning an old reservoir into a private lake for their retreat. They lowered the dam to build a carriage path and failed to maintain it properly. On May 31st, 1889, after days of heavy rain, the dam burst. A wall of water roared down the valley and destroyed the town of Johnstown, killing more than 2,000 people. Survivors later testified that warning signals might have saved lives had the club acted responsibly. The club's wealthy members, including Frick, Carnegie, and Mellon, paid no legal penalty. They donated money to relief efforts, but never admitted culpability. Frick later built a mansion on New York's Fifth Avenue and filled it with old master paintings. Today, the Frick collection is one of the city's most serene museums. Visitors admire portraits of aristocrats and landscapes of Venice, and rarely think about the workers and towns washed away by negligence. No family better illustrates the connection between new money, media power, and architectural extravagance than the Hearsts. George Hearst made his fortune in the Comstock lode and other mining ventures, using cunning and risk-taking to wrest wealth from the earth. His son, William Randolph Hearst, inherited mining stocks and turned a failing San Francisco newspaper into a media empire. He understood that sensational headlines sold papers. He covered crime, scandal, and wars with an eye for drama. He printed rumors as facts and sometimes helped create the news he reported. Politicians feared his wrath. With his fortune, he began building a retreat on a hilltop near San Simeon, California. What started as a modest bungalow became a sprawling compound with towers, terraces, gardens, and indoor and outdoor pools. Hearst employed architect Julia Morgan to translate his fantasies into stone. He scavenged European monasteries, churches, and castles for ceilings, fireplaces, and tapestries. Zebras roamed the property alongside imported deer and antelope. Hollywood stars, politicians, and athletes visited the estate, drinking Prohibition-era contraband and watching films in his private theater. Hearst's companion, Marion Davies, a talented actress, hosted guests in the sumptuous guest houses. But the Great Depression and Hearst's own profligacy strained his finances. Creditors demanded payment. Hearst had to sell art. The castle remained, but he never completed it. After his death, the estate passed to the state of California and is now open to the public. The citizens who tour Hearst Castle marvel at its opulence and learn how quickly fortune can turn to debt when ambition outruns reality. The Guggenheim family also rose through mining. Meyer Guggenheim immigrated from Switzerland and invested in Pennsylvania coal before turning to Colorado silver. He and his 7 sons formed the Guggenheim Brothers Mining Company, which acquired smelting and refining operations around the world. Their riches allowed them to purchase mansions in New York and yachts for Mediterranean cruises. The family's most public tragedy occurred on the Titanic. Benjamin Guggenheim, one of Meyer's sons, boarded the ill-fated liner with his valet and mistress. When the ship struck the iceberg, he refused to wear a life vest, reportedly saying that the situation was serious and he wanted to meet it dressed in his best. He changed into evening clothes and was last seen enjoying a brandy and a cigar in the smoking room. His death, like Astor's, symbolized the vulnerability of even the most privileged men. Another branch of the family turned to art. Solomon R. Guggenheim collected non-representational art and funded the construction of a museum to house it. He commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to design the building, which spirals upward and invites visitors to experience art in motion. The museum opened in 1959, 10 years after Solomon's death. It stands as a monument to the power of wealth rechanneled into culture. But for every museum, there are tales of internecine lawsuits and disagreements among heirs. As generations multiplied, the fortune diluted. Some cousins sued each other over trust distributions. Others left the family business altogether. The Guggenheim name today evokes art more than mining, illustrating how families can reinvent themselves to maintain relevance, but also how the original enterprise can vanish. The Mellon family, another Pittsburgh dynasty, started with Thomas Mellon, an Irish immigrant who became a judge and banker. His sons, Andrew and Richard, expanded the bank and invested in aluminum, oil, and chemicals. Andrew Mellon served as Treasury Secretary under 3 presidents in the 1920s, advocating for tax cuts and policies that favored business. He collected art, supported the National Gallery of Art, and donated his collection to the nation. Yet his personal life was tumultuous. He married a much younger woman, divorced after a scandalous court battle, and endured public scrutiny. His daughter Ailsa inherited a large fortune and spent her life giving it away to charitable causes. Richard Mellon endowed the Mellon Institute, which later merged with the Carnegie Institute of Technology to form Carnegie Mellon University. The Mellons survived the fall of many peers because they diversified and kept their business interests private. They avoided ostentatious display. Even so, intra-family litigation over trusts and taxes consumed energy. During the New Deal, Andrew Mellon was prosecuted for tax evasion, though he was ultimately acquitted. The trial embarrassed him and eroded his reputation. The Mellons demonstrate that even when wealth endures, it does not shield its owners from public anger or from the painful consequences of personal decisions. The 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of the industries that enriched the elites. The factory occupied the upper floors of a building near Washington Square. Hundreds of immigrant women and girls stitched blouses for long hours in cramped conditions. On March 25th, a fire broke out. The managers had locked the exit doors to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. Flames spread rapidly. Workers were trapped. Some jumped from windows to escape, plunging to their deaths before horrified spectators. In all, 146 people died. The factory owners, who were part of the garment industry elite, escaped punishment. Public outrage led to the creation of new safety standards and strengthened unions like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The disaster shifted the political winds. Even some members of high society, who had previously ignored working conditions, joined calls for reform. The women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, and the progressives found common cause. The fire helped persuade Americans that unregulated industry could be lethal. In hindsight, it shows how the elite's pursuit of profit without adequate concern for safety contributed to their eventual fall. The laws that emerged curtailed their autonomy and forced them to share power with regulators and workers. On the opposite end of the social spectrum, Tuxedo Park, a private enclave in upstate New York, offers a glimpse into the rituals and fashions of the elites. Founded in 1885 by tobacco heir Pierre Lorillard IV as a hunting and fishing preserve, the gated community attracted members of the 400. Stanford White designed shingled cottages and a lavish clubhouse. Guests traveled by train from New York and changed from travel clothes into evening attire at the lodge before attending dinners and dances. It was at Tuxedo Park, according to lore, that Griswold Lorillard introduced a shorter black dinner jacket that scandalized older men and eventually became the tuxedo. The park enforced strict rules: no outsiders, no businesses, no display of vulgarity. Residents rode horses along bridle paths and rowed across the lake. But by the early 20th century, the exclusivity began to chafe younger members. Automobiles made it easier to travel to other destinations. The Great Depression hit even wealthy families, and they sold their cottages. World War II further eroded the community as servants enlisted and gasoline rationing limited travel. Today, Tuxedo Park still exists, but many of the original families have gone. The tuxedo lives on as a garment worn to proms and weddings, divorced from its elite origins. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, New York City's Fifth Avenue transformed from a residential street lined with mansions into a commercial boulevard. The rise of department stores and hotels encroached on the elite's territory. The Vanderbilt twins at 640 and 660 Fifth Avenue survived for decades, but one by one the houses were sold to businesses that offered sums too large to refuse. The property taxes on these lots skyrocketed as commercial values increased. A 60-room residence that required dozens of servants to operate made little sense when the same land could generate far more income. The occupants found themselves living in a museum and paying for the privilege. Some families moved to the Upper East Side, where narrower streets allowed for townhouses and cooperative apartment buildings. Others decamped to the suburbs. When the last of the Fifth Avenue palaces were demolished, newspapers mourned the passing of an age. Workers salvaged marble mantels and wood paneling, which were installed in new houses or sold at auction. Ornate iron gates ended up guarding university buildings. The street that once symbolized exclusivity became a shopping destination for the middle class. The fall of the mansions was both practical and symbolic. It signaled that the spatial dominance of the old families was over. Yet the legacies of these elites persist in the institutions they founded. Universities like the University of Chicago, founded by Rockefeller, Carnegie Mellon University, Vanderbilt University, and the Pratt Institute owe their existence to fortunes amassed during the Gilded Age. Libraries funded by Carnegie and Rockefeller stand in towns across the country. Art collections donated by Frick, Morgan, and Mellons fill museums that educate millions. Conservation initiatives created by Biltmore's George Vanderbilt and later heirs preserved forests in the southern Appalachians. Foundations established by Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, and others continue to fund medical research, education, and public health. These philanthropic efforts complicate the narrative. They suggest that while the elite families fell from social prominence, the money they made still shapes the world in positive ways. At the same time, philanthropy served as a shield against criticism, enabling elites to soften their image. When we admire a Monet in a museum or attend a concert in a hall bearing a tycoon's name, we are in dialogue with their legacy. We should remember that these benefits were built on labor that was often poorly compensated and lives that were sometimes sacrificed. Even after the Gilded Age, wealth in America did not disappear. It flowed into new industries. The 19th century's railroads and oil gave way to the 20th century's automobiles, chemicals, and electronics. Today, technology firms and hedge funds dominate the wealth rankings. Silicon Valley billionaires build compounds on hillsides, collect art, and fund philanthropic foundations. Their parties echo the balls at the Waldorf and the dinners at Biltmore. They charter private jets instead of private rail cars. They invest in spaceflight instead of yachts. They are praised for innovation and criticized for monopolistic practices. The arc is familiar. History suggests that they too will face regulation, public scrutiny, and the challenges of passing wealth to heirs who may or may not share their vision. The story of the Gilded Age elites is thus not merely a chapter in the past, but a cautionary tale for the present. Every generation writes its own Gilded Age. How it ends depends on whether those who benefit most learn from the failures of their predecessors. Finally, there is the human tendency to forget. Once the mansions are gone, once the names fade from headlines, the memories of extravagance and inequity can soften. Nostalgia can gild the past anew, turning exploitation into romance. Films and novels set in Newport or on ocean liners celebrate costumes and dances and seldom dwell on strikes or floods. Visiting a restored dining room, one can almost hear the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk. Without context, the space can feel like a fantasy. The dark story risks being sanitized. That is why revisiting the full narrative matters. The gilding was always thin. Underneath were stories of ambition, ingenuity, brutality, resilience, arrogance, creativity, callousness, vision, and hubris. Telling the story honestly honors the workers who laid the tracks and sewed the blouses as much as the architects and heiresses. It acknowledges the lives lost in floods and fires alongside the art hung in galleries. And it invites us, as visitors and citizens, to decide how we will respond when we encounter extravagance in our own time. Will we admire it, critique it, demand accountability, or all three? The answer will shape the next fall, or perhaps avert it. Social competition among the elites often took the form of culture. In the 1870s, the opera was the battlefield on which New York society fought its most visible skirmishes. The Academy of Music on East 14th Street had long been controlled by old Knickerbocker families, who owned the private boxes surrounding the stage and allocated invitations carefully. New money from railroads and mines could not penetrate this circle, no matter how large their fortunes. In response, a group of newly rich patrons, led by the Vanderbilts and the Goulds, financed the construction of a new opera house, the Metropolitan. Opened in 1883 on Broadway and 39th Street, it dwarfed the Academy. Its stage was larger, its seating capacity greater, its architecture more imposing. Most importantly, its 60 private boxes were sold to families who had been excluded from the Academy. The design of the boxes, arranged in tiers like a horseshoe, turned the audience into an exhibit. People came not just to listen to Verdi or Wagner, but to see who occupied which box, whose gown was the most extravagant, whose jewels sparkled brightest. The Metropolitan Opera symbolized the triumph of new money over old. Yet within a few decades, it too faced financial difficulties and had to solicit public donations. When the opera relocated to Lincoln Center in the 1960s, its original house was demolished. The War of Culture produced a monument that lasted less than a century. The opera's boxes, once the ultimate status symbol, are now accessible to anyone who purchases a ticket, reflecting a democratization that would have horrified Caroline Astor. Politics intruded into the Gilded Age in violent ways. President James Garfield was assassinated in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker. President William McKinley was shot in 1901 by an anarchist who claimed to act on behalf of the poor. Leon Czolgosz, McKinley's assassin, had been influenced by speeches decrying inequality and injustice. He stood in line at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo and used a concealed revolver to shoot the president at close range while shaking his hand. In his confession, he said that he believed McKinley represented an oppressive government allied with capitalists. McKinley died of gangrene 8 days later. His death shocked the nation and elevated Vice President Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Roosevelt's subsequent pursuit of trust-busting and progressive reforms can be seen as partly a response to the conditions that nurtured radicalism. The assassination was not simply the act of a madman, but a symptom of a society straining under extremes of wealth and poverty. Earlier labor conflicts like the Haymarket Affair of 1886, where a bomb exploded during a rally for an 8-hour workday and led to the execution of anarchists, also illustrate how political violence emerged from social tensions. The elites may have been insulated by walls and servants, but bullets and bombs could penetrate those barriers. Their fall was not just economic. It was a recognition that no amount of gold leaf could guarantee safety in a divided nation. Urban transformation in the Gilded Age often entailed the displacement of entire communities. Central Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux as a green oasis for the city, required clearing the land of its inhabitants. One such community was Seneca Village, a settlement of free Black Americans and Irish immigrants established in the 1820s on what is now the park's west side. Residents built homes, a school, and churches. They owned property, a rarity for African Americans at the time, and voted. In the 1850s, the city used eminent domain to seize the land, arguing that a park would benefit the public. Officials portrayed the village as a shantytown to justify its destruction. Families were forced out, their houses razed, their graves relocated. Wealthy New Yorkers who later strolled the park or rode in carriages did so on land taken from people with fewer resources and less political power. The story of Seneca Village faded from memory until archaeologists unearthed its foundations in the 21st century. It serves as a reminder that the landscapes and institutions enjoyed by the elites were often built on dispossession. The park's creation improved air quality and provided recreation, but it also exemplified a pattern. The elite's vision shaped the city without regard for those in the way. When the elites fell, the communities they had displaced were long gone. The new residents of the city walked paths designed for carriages and sat on benches under elms planted for someone else's leisure. Remembering Seneca Village and similar communities adds depth to the dark story, showing that the fall of the elites did not automatically restore what had been lost. In drawing these threads together, it becomes clear that the Gilded Age was less a distinct period than a recurring human condition. Whenever technology leaps ahead and rules lag behind, whenever a few individuals control levers that affect millions, a Gilded Age is at hand. The men and women who built railroads, newspapers, steel mills, and mansions were neither purely villains nor heroes. They were people shaped by their times, blind to some consequences and keenly aware of others. They changed the landscape of the United States in ways both beneficial and harmful. Their fall reminds us that systems built on inequality are unstable. Their legacies remind us that wealth can be wielded for public good or for private indulgence. As we navigate our own era of concentrated wealth and rapid innovation, it is worth asking which lessons we have learned and which we have ignored. The structures may differ: servers instead of smokestacks, skyscrapers instead of cottages, IPOs instead of rail bonds. But the underlying dynamics feel familiar. Watching the rise and fall of yesterday's elites can inspire empathy, caution, and perhaps a determination to build a society where success does not require others to fail, and where gilding is not a veneer but a reflection of genuine value.